I would love for the world to just go vegan. It'd be fantastic from an ethical, from environmental standpoint, all of that. But I think we need to look at how can we make the biggest impact. Do we want 1,000 people going vegan, or do we want 100,000 people eating more plant-based?
Hello and welcome back to my show. I am excited for today's episode. We have Dr. Matthew Nagra here with us today, and we're going to be talking about all things myths in regarding nutrition, particularly when it comes to plant-based nutrition, because there is a lot of conflicting information out there on the internet, and I thought to myself, who better than someone like Matthew, who specializes in the latest research, to come on the show, and hopefully we can bring more clarity around some of these myths and maybe even talk about some of the latest evidence that is available to us today. So, Dr. Matthew Nagra is a naturopathic doctor devoted to bringing the most up-to-date evidence-based nutrition information to his patients at his clinic in Vancouver. In 2018, he graduated from the Boucher Institute of Naturopathic Medicine after completing his Bachelor's of Science in Microbiology at the University of Victoria. He is certified in plant-based nutrition through Cornell University and has written articles for Dr. T. Colin Campbell's Center for Nutrition Studies. Dr. Nagra is known for his social media platforms where he often tackles misinformation around diet and nutrition and deep dives into the latest nutrition studies. So, Doctor, that I don't know if that was intentional or not. Did you hear that?
I didn't hear anything.
Okay, my headphones just started clapping all of a sudden.
Oh, no.
So
I didn't hear
it was
anything.
like there was an audience clapping for your introduction, which would have been really cool if everybody else heard it. But Matthew, welcome to the show. I'm really happy to have you on today.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I've been a fan of your work for quite some time. And actually, funny story, I think you met my dad at Venice Beach once a couple years ago, and he had just the nicest things to say, too. So hopefully
What?
we can do that sometime.
Wow, you know what? Now that you mention that, I think I do have a memory of
Yeah.
someone telling me about their son being a naturopathic doctor in Vancouver. Wow,
That would be
that's
it.
crazy.
Yep.
I had completely forgotten about that. What a small world.
Yeah.
What an absolutely small world. So, well, it's cool to be able to connect with you here and to remind me of that memory. We have like a lot of mutual friends in the plant-based and nutrition space. So
Mhm.
I think Simon was the one that introduced us, and we had a few conversations since then. And like I said, I'm really happy to have you on because I think especially with the landscape of the amount of information that's being pumped out on the daily on social media has, I don't know, exponentially grown since my my initial start with social media back in 2015. And back then there was hardly anything that I could find on the subject, especially regarding plant-based nutrition, vegan diets, vegetarian diets. And now I feel like there is a plethora of different accounts that are commonly posting information, and sometimes that information can be maybe misinformation, or it can be just out of context, or maybe embellished. And I think that that can be dangerous, especially when people's health is reliant, or this is where they're gathering their information from influencers that may not have credentials. And I'll be the first one to say that I am also somebody that puts information out there. And I always try to speak first and foremost from personal experience and to the best of my knowledge with the supported evidence. But I think that there are much more qualified individuals like yourself that dedicate, their career towards reading the scientific literature, understanding the nature of these studies, and then putting out the correct information with more context. So, like I said, I'm just really happy to have you on today to talk about some of these things.
Yeah, thanks. And I love talking about this topic because it is, there's so much out there, as you mentioned, and it is so confusing for somebody to try to navigate. for someone who doesn't have kind of background info or knowledge on how to interpret scientific research, oftentimes it's going to, okay, what does this person say about it? It's almost like you're just accepting one person's view or opinion, or a couple people's views or opinions on a topic as being a valid representation of what that science says. And it can be great. I mean, I think there are good people who are really, really good at it, like Simon Hill is one of them, that we were just chatting about. But then there are a lot of cases where things get misrepresented or skewed to fit a certain narrative. And that's what I try to clarify as much, or clear up as much as possible.
Yeah, and I think coming from both camps or from multiple camps, right? Nowadays there's several different camps in the nutritional space that have kind of key leaders in each space that tend to be the carrying the torch for each representative, and a lot of times they can have conflicting views, which can be very confusing because one camp is telling you that avoid vegetables and fruit at all costs because of lectins or
Yeah.
oxalates. And then there's another camp that's saying just eat raw meat and liver as because it's the most nutritional food available. Then you have another camp that may be avoiding carbohydrates altogether. Then you have the raw food camp. Like even within each camp, there are subgroups, and that can be very confusing because when one camp touts their dietary preference as the silver bullet, then everyone is like, well, that must mean everybody else's dietary pattern must be wrong.
Yeah, and it's like you can go into a bookstore, into the nutrition section, and get a like low fat, whole foods plant-based book literally right next to a high animal fat keto book. Saying literally exactly the opposite thing. And they're given oftentimes kind of equal credibility. And I'm not saying that a lot of these plant-based books and things are perfect either. They aren't. There are certain issues I take, and that's one thing that I try to do as well, is also debunk what I believe is some misinformation from that camp. Um, Unfortunately, it's not popular to have that more balanced view on, like, these are the fundamentals of a healthy diet that we know. That these are the things that are very consistent across populations, typically whole grain, fruit, vegetable, legume, nut and seed consumption, vegetable oil consumption, as much as that gets a bad rap as well. And minimizing meat consumption if you were to have meat, lean cuts. Seafood tends to be associated with good health outcomes, low fat dairy as well. And that's just not popular. It's not the like sexy thing, to promote. Of course, I think there are a lot of other reasons to shift towards an even more exclusive plant-based diet, being environmental factors, ethical factors. The fact that for some people, like probably myself when I first got into it, it's easier for me to go all in than to
Hmm.
give myself some leeway because there's a slippery slope there. Um, and these are the types of things that I try to put out there, and again just clarify that, look, there's a lot of ways to eat really healthy, and these extremes tend to not be it.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that what's interesting, especially about the plant-based movement or the vegan movement in particular, is that it's the only camp that has ethics strongly weaved in to the dietary pattern, which can then muddy the water a bit when it comes to people that are very passionate about this way of life, but then might not have the correct or scientific information to support what they're saying online. So this can lead to maybe some false claims or embellishment
Mhm.
of what the vegan diet can actually do for you. And the other camps don't have that. Like what's interesting is that for somebody promoting a carnivore diet, even if it's the head, the ringleader of the carnivore diet, nobody's following them around or criticizing them if they deviate from that diet. Like if they're
Yeah.
traveling and they go to a restaurant and they're not eating raw meat or whatever their dietary pattern is for their camp, nobody's really holding them accountable for that, and there's no consequence of it. But with the vegan diet, because it's so strongly connected to ethics and morals, the moment that somebody deviates from that diet, it comes along with all of this other uh, backlash or consideration or judgment, whatever you want to call it. And I just find that really interesting because many of these experts, at least from what I can see, and just being a realist, they're probably not living their diets as much as they promote it online, the way that somebody in the vegan camp lives, eats, breathes this way of life. And it's 0 or 1. There's no deviating from it because it has that strong ethical pipeline as well.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where a distinction between like veganism and plant-based comes in. When it
Hmm.
comes to plant-based, like a Mediterranean diet is plant-based, DASH diet, all of these, generally very healthy plant-based dietary patterns are plant-based. Um, and it's when it becomes vegan, specifically, that is kind of an ethical or moral stance, right? And so I get that there's going to be backlash in a lot of cases when someone has been vegan, has promoted ethics and all that for a long time, and then starts to deviate. But at the same time, when promoting this sort of lifestyle, I mean, I would love for the world to just go vegan. It'd be fantastic from an ethical, from an environmental standpoint, all of that. But I think we need to look at how can we make the biggest impact. Do we want 1,000 people going vegan, or do we want 100,000 people eating more plant-based? Like, what is going to do more for the animals in the long run, for the environment, and obviously for
Hmm.
public health? And so that's where some of the, I guess, strict vegan mindsets when it comes to promoting this stuff kind of comes with its issues.
Hmm.
And that's, again, I would love the world to go vegan, but that's where I try to promote more of a plant-based approach. And wherever people can go with that, if it's incorporating a few more servings of legumes in place of meat per week, let's start with that. Let's start right there, and
Hmm.
then make as much of a shift as possible. And if someone was strictly plant-based and starts incorporating some more animal products, obviously, again, I would love for them to be strictly plant-based, but if they're still eating a predominantly plant-based diet, that's still a lot better than going all the way the other direction.
Side of the spectrum. Yeah, I think
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
an important distinction, right? Is I've said it before on this podcast that I'm a firm believer in progress over perfection, and
Hmm.
I think that perfection can deter people from even exploring this plant-based lifestyle because of the pressure that comes along with it, especially when it comes to posting about it or talking about it. The moment, like I said, if you deviate from that decision, then that comes along with judgment. But that doesn't apply to the other dietary camps. Like, no one's
Yeah.
going to judge the ringleader of the keto camp if they stop being keto for a day.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
it's
like,
an
yeah.
interesting place to be. So using the words vegan or plant based, they can be interchangeable, but I think that maybe plant based is a less triggering word
Hmm.
for many people, allows people to be more open to the idea just because of the decades of, I don't know, judgment
Hmm.
or perception that comes along with the word vegan.
Yeah, yeah, because if you say you're vegan, and as you were saying, switch back to consuming some animal products, that is, if you were vegan for ethical reasons, which is what veganism is, then people will come after you because you've
Hmm.
essentially ditched your ethical framework. Whereas if you eat plant-based and it's specifically for health reasons, and you start incorporating some more animal products, it's not as shocking to the public, as an
Hmm.
influencer, say, for sure. And on the note of keto, carnivore, and that, I mean, we have a big name carnivore doctor who's now including fruit and rice and honey in their diet, but still calling themselves a carnivore, and nobody seems to have a big problem with it, right? Imagine if it was
Yeah.
on the opposite side and it was a vegan.
Yeah. I find that really interesting because
Yeah.
when I hear it, it it's a bit frustrating sometimes because, like I said, sometimes. Oh no, 1 second. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
Um, Whenever I hear them promoting their dietary dogma, essentially online, I highly doubt. I'm skeptical. I'm a skeptic. I'm very skeptical that if they are talking about, yeah, but I only eat locally raised or local farms, grass fed, uh,
Hmm.
all of these different kind of like humane washing terms or
Hmm.
greenwashing terms that come along with eating those types of animal products. I just really find it hard to believe that they're actually verifying where the sources came from whenever they're traveling, if they're exclusively cooking that type of food at home, or when they go to a friend's house, do they eat whatever's available for them? And that's the part that kind of can feel um, I don't know, just misaligned, where it's like you're promoting something, but you're not actually truly living it. And this is all just me, you know, being skeptical. But
Yeah.
when it comes to vegans, it's like there's no deviating from it. Like you're doing it everywhere. Like when I go to an airport and there's very little vegan options, I'm gonna make it work. Like I'm gonna
Yeah.
eat a bag of
Some trail
nuts.
mix or something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm gonna find some trail mix and make it work
Yeah.
until I get to a grocery store or a place where I can get some vegan food. But I just really doubt that the other people in those camps have the conviction to do that. So it's just can be a little bit frustrating. But again, I'm not here to pass judgment on them, but it's just more so the fact that publicly they really defend their diets, but then who knows if they're actually following
Mhm.
through fully.
I'm with you. I'm with you on that, especially when it comes to eating out, traveling, and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
For us, it's like, hey, what are the vegan options? You're not always going to have a grass-fed or hunted or whatever. Not that I
Yeah.
think those are necessarily ethical anyway, but you're not always going to have those options available.
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember one time I went to, I believe it was Thailand, and I had a layover in Beijing or Guangzhou or one of those airports in China. And I was there for about 8 hours. It was the only place that I've ever been that I found it really difficult to find vegan food because I can't read the language
Oh
and
yeah.
I just didn't know what was in it, and I was not going to take a risk. And so I think I did find some type of nuts or something that I was able to survive off of. But that's been the one time where I found it really difficult, and because I was restricted to staying in the airport in my section. But just throwing it out, I'm mentioning this because I've been around the world and been many different places, and I've never found it difficult to find plant-based options that are tasty and widely available, like regardless of what part of the world you're in. So that's also probably the first myth that I would talk about is this fact that it's difficult to be vegan outside of the United States. I would assert that a lot or many parts of the world traditionally have more plant-based diet with smaller amounts of animal products, but now with the westernization of most of these other places in the world, now more and more meat consumption is becoming more prevalent. And what's interesting is that these places that want to eat like the West are now dying like the West as well, or
Mhm.
developing these disorders or disease like the West have been.
Yeah, and actually speaking to traveling and being able to maintain this sort of diet. I mean, it'll be 11 years for me in a couple weeks, and I've traveled all over too, Europe, Australia, Central America, and just never really had a problem.
Hmm.
And actually, as the years have gone on, it's just become easier and easier. I
Hmm.
can remember maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago where sometimes, especially in an airport, you'd be stuck and there wouldn't be much around. But at this point, like you can even get, if you need a Beyond Burger in most airports at this point. I remember I had one of
Hmm.
those. I think I was flying back from Scotland or something recently, and yeah, and they just had Beyond Burgers on the menu at one of the places, and hey, if there's nothing else around, I'm gonna have
Yeah, I think that's thank goodness for for these types of companies that are becoming more and more available. Because I remember whenever growing up, I was raised plant based as well, and there was one brand of veggie burger that I can recall. There was no cheeses. There was none of the
that.
options that are available today. So, people that are plant based might not know how difficult it was back then compared to
Yeah.
what it is now. But even so, those really accessible ingredients that are common in most places in the world, rice, beans, veggies, fruit, all of those things are available. You just have to, know first and foremost what, those foods are to plan ahead, to look for them. Because I know that many people don't even know what qualifies as a vegan meal. Like, oh, what do vegans even eat? And they don't even realize that something like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich is something that's vegan and that you can get
Hmm.
anywhere, or rice and beans, or burritos, or bowls, or all of these things that might be highly accessible in their area, but just don't even know to look at the menu for those types of foods.
Yeah, no, I agree, and especially being of Indian background, like you know, dal and rice or
Yeah,
chickpea
yeah.
curries and things. I mean,
That's
it's
what
so
I grew
easy.
up on the same thing. I grew
Yeah.
up with all of that too. So let's dive into the first. I would say the most common myth or misconception about plant-based diets, and that is protein.
Hmm.
I'm sure that you get it often. I'm sure that you've had many DMs and conversations about this. I know I have over the years. So I would love to hear from your perspective, being a naturopathic doctor. What are your views on protein and vegan diets?
Yeah, so there are a few different kind of claims that we have to hit here. The first one is usually whether or not you can get enough protein. And, it's true that in general, legumes, which are a decent protein source or decent plant-based protein source, are going to provide less protein per calorie than something like meat. However, we can't just limit ourselves to that. There's so much more out there. You have seitan, TVP. Both of those can provide a similar amount of protein per calorie to even lean meats. Tofu can be similar to your standard beef. Now we have just egg, which is pretty much identical to egg as far as protein content. Tofu is actually higher if you're to make a tofu scramble. So it's all about what you replace these foods with. Because generally speaking, aside from, say, carnivore diets, generally speaking, people get protein from both plants and animals. And all you're doing if you're swapping to a vegan or plant-based diet is you're swapping out some of those animal foods for plant foods. And so, sure, if you were to swap a steak for chickpeas, you'll be decreasing your protein intake. But if you were to swap steak for seitan, or even for tofu, again, depending on the type, you could have a similar amount of protein per calorie, provided you eat the same amount of calories. So it's really all about what you're replacing with. Um, so that's kind of the one thing that often comes up. But then you'll get these arguments that okay, even if you eat enough protein, it's not the same. You don't get all the
Hmm.
amino acids, for example. Well, that's false. All plants contain all of the essential amino acids, which are the 9 amino acids we need to get in our diet that our bodies don't make themselves. Um, but they are present in varying amounts in different plant foods. So if you're to eat animal foods, typically you have a pretty decent balanced ratio of these amino acids. From individual plant foods, like if you were to have just legumes, you might be lower in certain amino acids. If you had just rice or other grains, again, lower, not that they're high protein sources anyway. But we don't eat just one food. We eat diets comprised of multiple foods throughout the day. And so they complement each other. So if you were to have, and actually I should say soy is pretty good across the board anyway, but for other legumes, for other types of grains, fruits, vegetables, all of these things have protein. And when you're eating a diet comprised of all of those, you end up with a decent amino acid profile anyway, provided that you're consuming enough overall calories and
Hmm.
enough overall protein. And then you get into the argument of, okay, well, it's not as bioavailable. You don't absorb as much as the protein or as much of the protein from plant sources as you do from animal sources. And that's kind of based on a misconception of how protein digestibility is scored. So,
Hmm.
so I'm going to get a little scientific here, but I'm going to try to keep it relatively, easy to follow. There are two main scoring systems that we use. There's the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score, PDCAS for short, and then there's the digestible indispensable amino acid score, or DAS or DIAS for short, depending on how you want to pronounce that. Um, Now, the PDCAS is essentially measured by feeding foods to rodents most of the time and measuring how much protein goes in and how much comes out the other end. And the difference is, supposedly how much was absorbed. But there are a couple issues. For one, we aren't rodents. We have different protein needs. Our digestive tracts are not the same. So human data would be better there. And they measure digestibility through the whole digestive tract, which also isn't super accurate since some of the bacteria, especially lower down in the gut, will also chew up some of the protein.
Mm.
But perhaps the biggest issue, actually, not even perhaps, this is the biggest issue. They score it based on amino acid content. So, as I mentioned, individual plants will have typically lower amounts of certain amino acids, meaning that if you were to just have that single food as your only protein source and just barely meet your minimum protein requirement for the day, you would be deficient in maybe one or two amino acids. But again, that's completely irrelevant if you were to eat multiple different types of foods because they will complement each other with the amino acid profiles. Then we move on to the Diaz score. It has some of the same issues, but tries to correct on some of them. For one, it measures digestibility in pigs, closer to humans as far as digestive tract, but still not identical in different protein needs, and they're rapidly growing, so there are some issues there. Um, they actually insert, and this isn't great, but they insert a tube through the abdomen, which attaches to the end of the small intestine. So they measure digestibility between the mouth and the end of the small intestine rather than through the entire digestive tract. So that's
Mm.
better as far as the bacterial digestion I mentioned. But again, the same issue with amino acid scores. They dock points essentially if it doesn't, or if a food doesn't meet every single amino acid requirement if you
Mm-hmm.
only ate, again, that individual food. So this is
Right.
useful in cases of like impoverished nations where they really only eat one or two foods. If they have very limited access, they're not having variety in their diet. This can be useful for making sure that they meet their protein needs by ensuring they have access to foods that have a high score on either PDCAS or DS. But for those of us who are fortunate enough to have access to, a varied diet, a nutritious diet, it's really irrelevant. And so what's better is to look at overall protein digestibility before removing or again docking points for the amino acid profile. And we have some limited data in humans on that, suggesting that when you compare plant proteins to animal proteins, the difference is maybe a few percent. Like it's going to be negligible. And
Mm.
if we were even concerned about that, all you have to do is eat just slightly more protein. That would be it,
Mm-hmm.
and you would meet your needs. So those are kind of the primary claims or issues that people take with plant versus animal protein. But what ultimately matters is how does it affect gains, right? Um,
Yeah.
if you swap out your animal protein for plant protein, do you build less muscle or build or improve strength to a lower degree? And we have studies on that. We have tons of studies comparing whey protein, which is considered a high quality animal protein, to either like rice, soy, pea protein, or other protein powders. And we don't see a statistically significant difference. It's very
Mm-hmm.
comparable across the board. And more recently, just last year, I think it was January 2021, we had kind of the study that should, for the most part, put this to bed. And that was they took 19 vegans and 19 meat eaters. They had the vegans consume, the regular diet, but also supplement some soy protein on top of that to meet their a higher protein intake of 1.6 grams per kilogram, which is typically what's recommended for strength building. And
Mm-hmm.
then they had the meat eaters do the same, but use whey protein. So both groups are getting most of their protein from food sources. If there was a lower digestibility of, say, food sources, plant versus animal, we would have probably seen it in this study, but we didn't. After 12 weeks of training, there was no difference in strength or size outcomes on any measure, or at least no statistically significant difference. So there's just not a reason to worry about the animal versus plant protein kind of topic, as long as you're eating enough protein and obviously you're lifting heavy things.
Yeah, I love that you went into depth on that because I feel like that brings a lot of light as to how these tests are administered
Mhm.
and the limiting nature of some of those tests compared to humans versus pigs or rats.
Yeah.
And also like just the fact that when you match the protein, whether it's coming from a plant-based source or a variety of plant-based sources with a protein supplement like coming from soy versus the opposite of that, so a combination of plant and animal foods plus a whey protein supplement, that there was no significant difference or statistical difference or
Mhm.
measurable difference between the two, because I get it all the time on my social channels, like every day, like, oh, but vegans, the protein content is inferior, meaning that they are losing, or they're less bioavailable, and you have to eat 50% more protein to
Oh my God,
meet
yeah.
the equivalent value of what you would need with whey protein, or just animal
Yeah.
protein in general. And I I'm not a scientist, and like, I know that's not true because I've personally built muscle throughout my entire bodybuilding career very easily with less protein than what is commonly recommended in most fitness and nutrition websites, where they recommend anywhere from 1 to 2 grams of protein per pound of body weight. So for somebody
Mhm.
like me that weighs 180 pounds, that would mean 180 to 360 grams of protein per day, which I do know bodybuilders that are in my same weight class that get upwards of 300 grams of protein per day. And it doesn't make sense if they're like, just fundamentally from a logic perspective, why are you consuming that much protein? First of all, because there is that like upper threshold where
The threshold, yeah.
you can't utilize all of that. And like, I think that 1.6 gram per kilogram number that you mentioned earlier is that upper threshold for most athletes. Anything
Yeah.
beyond that, you don't see any statistical significantly or more protein or muscle gain or strength gains, correct?
Yeah, it's like
Unless maybe you're on anabolics or something like that that exceeds your natural capability of
so
metabolizing protein, right?
so basically there seems to be a plateau there. That doesn't mean that, like, and that's an average. That doesn't mean certain individuals might benefit from a bit more versus, have even a
Mm-hmm.
lower plateau. So there might be individual differences, but on average, yeah, that's about it. And honestly, even going from like 1.2 grams per kilogram up to 1.6, the difference isn't massive either. Where we see that sharper, potential increase is going from that zero point 0.8 RDA up to about 1.2, if I recall. You
Mm.
see a sharper increase, and then it starts to plateau, but you still kind of benefit up to about 1.6, if I recall correctly there. So, um, yeah, that's usually what I suggest athletes aim for, and I just don't see much reason to suggest, a lot more than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's, now if only we could get this information out to the masses, because
Yeah.
it's an uphill battle to try to, answer every single one of these DMs that is, it's
Hmm.
so widely perpetuated that plant protein is inferior, and especially across platforms where, um, like from highly credible people as well. So
Hmm.
other doctors
Hmm.
and people, especially in the podcasting, social media space, you continue to hear it time after time that if you are eating a plant-based diet, you are going to be deficient in some amino acid that will then limit your ability to build muscle or to perform athletically, which you and I both know that's it's a false claim. And
Hmm.
or if you're only consuming one protein source, that may be
Yeah.
true, but that's just not a reality. Like, people don't eat that way. I can
Yeah.
think of one person that I've ever heard of that ate potatoes for a year, I believe.
Oh,
He
yeah,
did
I
a
think
whole
I've heard.
document.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think
yeah.
his name was Spudfit or something like that, and he just ate different potatoes for an entire year, and he still managed to at least live a year, so that's promising.
Yeah.
So, I don't know about his ability to build muscle and whatnot, but most people, if anybody, is going to eat that way, where it's just consuming one ingredient for the rest of your life.
Yeah, it's really nonsense. And like I think the for starters, a lot of that what you hear online about your 50% lower digestibility and that it comes from that fundamental misunderstanding of those scoring systems I mentioned, especially how it considers amino acids, amino acid profiles. Once you understand that, you can see through those claims. It's so, I'm glad at least people listening to this will get that now, because that is where it comes from. It comes from essentially docking the scores of these plant foods due to their lower availability of, one or two amino acids. And
Hmm.
then the other thing that really kind of frustrates me about this topic is we leave out the other benefits of plant protein. So we have several what are called substitution analyses. And this is where you look at what happens when you swap out individual either groups of foods or types of foods for others. So, we have multiple substitution analyses comparing just overall animal protein to plant protein. And when you swap out animal protein for plant protein at the same amount of protein, you significantly reduce risk of things like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, even all-cause mortality. And then when you look at individual specific types of foods, like, yeah, swapping out red meat is a big one. Eggs, actually swapping eggs for plant protein tends to perform or provide a huge benefit. And one of these studies for people who are interested is by author Huang, Huang, from, I believe, 2020. And that's usually one of the ones I cite the most often because it's just super well conducted. But I've never seen one of these substitution analyses that actually swayed the opposite direction, where it showed a benefit for health outcomes by eating more animal protein in place of plant protein. It's always been the plant protein coming out on top, as far as I'm aware, anyway.
So I know that you mentioned several like long-term benefits of that with like
Yeah.
reduction in heart disease and whatnot. Are
Mhm.
there any studies that show significant short-term benefits for, let's say, an athlete that is looking to increase their performance right away by swapping to plant-based protein sources?
So I haven't. Now, as far as athletics go, and this isn't exactly that topic, so this is kind of different, but there is some research comparing, say, vegetarians or vegans to meat eaters, and if anything, there seems like there might be a slight benefit for some endurance activities, specifically for women, actually. But the thing that matters to me is that there isn't a detriment. We don't actually
Mhm.
see a detriment to choosing plant protein over animal protein for physical performance, but we see a benefit for health outcomes. And of course, and I think you spoke about this when you had Simon on too, but we see the environmental benefits as well. So there is again that reason to choose more of the plant proteins beyond the fact that there's just no difference in performance outcomes.
And I assume that that's limited by the conduction of studies that are actually
Yeah.
looking for those outcomes, right? I mean, not. I feel like the maybe the literature just hasn't had time to catch up to those studies yet, or maybe nobody's been interested in them until now, more recently, after films like The Game Changers, and now doctors like yourself that are like, calling for this type of gap to be filled with a study to see what the outcomes are. I don't know if you know of any that are being conducted right now that are promising or maybe could fill some of those gaps.
So actually, that vegan versus omnivore study I was talking about, I've spoken with the lead author or the lead researcher behind that, and he's wanting to conduct a very similar study in elderly. And
Mm.
I think that would be huge because we have pretty good reason to believe that there just isn't a difference in young, healthy individuals at this point. I don't think there's much of an argument to be made otherwise. Now, as you age, your ability to digest protein decreases even further, and that's partially due to low stomach acid production. And so protein needs actually go up, and although there isn't a separate RDA, like recommended protein intake, for older individuals, there are a lot of researchers and a lot of scientists calling for that because there does seem to be benefit, especially in older age, to having higher protein intake. It would be amazing to see that comparison similar to what was done in the younger healthy individuals in an older population because at this point it's the only thing that we can't really answer at this point. Is there actually a difference in the most vulnerable individuals when it comes to ability to digest protein? I don't suspect there will be, but
Hmm.
it's not something we can say for sure at this point. And so that'd be great. And again, if that is even a concern, worst case, you just recommend slightly higher protein intake. It's not the end of the world
Hmm.
anyway. But still, it would be really nice to see that. And then the other thing that, again, I don't think we really need, but we could see is a similar study in highly trained individuals. So people who are already very
Hmm.
physically active, fit, because in that study they enrolled people who weren't trained. And
Hmm.
there's the noob gains as they call
Yeah.
them. And so is it actually are these gains actually largely due to muscle gains, or is it the way that
Is
nerves
it
are firing?
dietary
And then there's these
related?
other,
Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
there's all these other things. So that would be another one that would be good to see. But I know that those are being thought about. I don't know that they are
Hmm.
being conducted right now, but they are definitely being thought about. And hopefully we see something.
Yeah, I think that would be very appealing for the athletic crowd where they
Mm.
are already trained individuals, like people that I know that have been bodybuilding or training in their respective sport for years. They've already they've passed that window of newbie gains. Now they're in more of like
Yeah.
the slow, steady growth phase of their training regimens. And I firmly believe that if they were to swap their omnivorous diet for a plant-based diet, that they would experience training benefits. They would see body compositional changes, maybe reduction in fat, maybe increase in muscle size, increase in strength, increase in endurance, possibly better ability to focus, maybe digestively as well. They'd see some benefits because I know personally, just from my own personal experience, whenever I was training for since I was like 17, and I was reliant on whey protein until the age of 24, 25, somewhere around there. And I thought genuinely that it was part of the process whenever you were trying to get muscular and drink protein shakes that you experience like bubble guts, that's the
Oh,
scientific term,
yeah, yeah.
bubble guts and like gas and bloating and digestive discomfort, indigestion, like heartburn, all of these things. I thought it was natural. I thought that's just the way it was. And speaking with other bodybuilders and people in the sport, they also like say the same thing. So I was like, oh, it just confirmed, what I suspected. But whenever I switched to plant-based protein powders, especially, and eliminated all dairy products, I found that my digestive system really healed itself and was operating much more efficiently, regular bowel movements, no gas, even with me consuming more like legumes and high fibrous foods. I was maybe experienced some initially like more gas in those moments, but then my body quickly adapted and adjusted, and now I can process those foods really easily because I've been incorporating them for years now, and my digestive system just it's very, very sound now. And I've helped coach thousands of clients that have made that same transition. And again, initially they might experience an increase in fiber intake, which then can lead to some bloating or some digestive discomfort. But as long as they stick with it and incrementally introduce more fiber until they find that sweet spot of what they can handle, their digestive system tends to heal itself as well, which there are many other benefits to that, right? When it comes to just other bodily functions, when your digestive system is functioning properly or more efficiently.
Yeah, and with I mean, I kind of had a similar story to you, and I know a lot of people do, and with that sort of discomfort that can come on, especially when increasing legume intake or just fiber intake overall, it tends to pass, over the next few
Hmm.
months or so. I believe we have a little bit of research on that, but it would be a nice area to explore more. And then there's also things you can do. Soaking legumes seems to help. So there
Hmm.
are a few indigestible sugars actually in the legumes that the bacteria in our gut chew up and produce gas from. So you can remove a lot of that by soaking overnight and then cooking. And so that's often something that I suggest for people who are
Hmm.
experiencing
What
that,
about what
especially in the
about
early stage.
what about like canned beans
Canned,
and stuff?
if
Just
I were,
rinsing them thoroughly.
yeah, so I definitely say rinse anyway, but from what I recall, they contain less. It's still not as good as soaking overnight, but I can't recall the
Hmm.
specifics of that compared to the soaking yourself.
Hmm. Okay, yeah, that's normally what I tell my clients
Mhm.
as well. Is just like rinse them thoroughly. That tends to help with bloating, and then also just like slow down whenever you're eating. People
Mhm.
tend to really like or swallow
Yeah.
before they're ready to because they eat quickly, which is just another habit that has come along with the instant gratification kind of society that we live in now. Is how quickly can we get our food, how quickly can we eat it, how quickly can we go on to the next thing. So I really try to train my clients to eat slowly, to really chew their food, to take small sips when necessary of water, and not necessarily maybe swallow air, which can also lead to that digestive discomfort or gas.
Yeah.
So these are, and introducing things like mint and ginger tea, peppermint tea that helps with the digestibility and reducing some of those symptoms as well. Tend to really help people that are making that transition.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a lot of different sort of steps that individuals can take, and again, just reiterating, tends to be temporary.
Yeah.
Tends to resolve. So.
Yeah.
That slow incremental increase is the way that I like to go anyway.
I would love to hear some of your philosophy on just your own nutritional philosophy when you see patients. And if especially maybe if we kept this conversation on the athletic side, because I feel like a majority of my audience is primarily young and athletic and looking to improve their performance, or maybe have an existing plant-based diet and looking to optimize it, or maybe
Mhm.
interested in adopting a plant-based lifestyle, but maybe on the fence about whether or not it's suitable for them and their fitness goals.
Yeah, so I'd say my approach with an athlete would be a bit different than my approach with, say, someone with diabetes or heart disease.
Yeah, for sure.
But usually, I mean, in a first initial visit with anyone, I review their diet, in depth, every day. What's their meals, or what do their meals typically look like, and then I look at, okay, what can we swap? I look at the kind of individual swaps or changes that we can make. So, if it's somebody, let's say, with high cholesterol, and they're having, well, let's say they're even vegetarian, but they're having like full fat milk or whatever, well, swapping that for soy milk can make a significant impact. And so I'll look at where I can work around those sorts of factors. Now, if it's an athlete, yeah, we'll review their protein intake. We'll look at their overall calorie intake, and see what their specific goals are. But I'll often try to see, because sometimes I do get clients who are more into athletics, but maybe are not eating a lot of protein. Maybe they're having oatmeal for breakfast, a smoothie for lunch, and then maybe they have some tofu with their dinner, and really outside of the dinner, they're not getting much in the way of protein.
Mhm.
So I'll try to fuse like, okay, for the smoothie, let's try to add soy milk and actually consider a protein powder and toss that in. Um, if we're doing, oatmeal, it can be a bit tougher too, but again, soy milk in there can be great, or actually in some cases, a protein powder in there can be good too. If for dinner, they want to up protein further, seitan is fantastic, super high in protein, a great way to get that in. Um, and then, we always want to look at carbohydrate intake too, especially for more um, uh, for things like, I'm a soccer player, for example. You want to make sure you've got enough glycogen stores there to fuel you through. And so a lot of the times I get people coming in who are maybe more on the low carb side, and experimenting. Maybe they saw some podcast, or listened to some
Mhm.
podcasts, or saw some YouTube videos or social media, or whatever. And I'll just kind of review some of the literature on that, and especially for things like keto diets and athletic performance, and it's not very good based on what we have. And so I'll try to see where can we, include more or infuse more carbohydrates into one's diet. Um, and sometimes there's a bit of a mindset shift that needs to happen, in which case we'll start small. I'm always about starting with those simple things, the easier things. And
Mhm.
so, maybe if they're doing, I don't know, a big salad for lunch. Well, okay, maybe we throw some quinoa into the salad. Start with that, and see how you feel, and shift the next meal, and take it just one step at a time.
Mhm. Would you say that you follow any type of like ratio, or do you establish their protein needs first based off of what sport they're competing in, and then make sure you account for that first, and then maybe move on to the fats and then leave the rest for carbohydrates? Is that an
Um,
accurate approach, or?
I'd say that's a decent representation, but it depends a lot on, like you said, the athletic goals. I don't think there's necessarily one exact macronutrient ratio that's ideal. I think
Mhm.
there is quite a range. I think we can say pretty confidently that, again, things like keto might not be the best for strength or power, or that sort of thing. Um, but yeah, I usually just review protein intakes. I think that's an easy one, and I do believe there are benefits to higher protein intakes, specifically higher plant protein intake, for overall health outcomes too.
Mhm.
And that's, again, something that we're seeing pretty consistently in the research. So I established that. Okay, how can we increase this if needed? And then usually I look at carbohydrate quality as well. So not necessarily, again, an exact ratio, but not super low carb either. but are they doing a lot of refined carbohydrates and things like that, or are they having those brown rice, quinoa, whole wheat, the more whole grain sources, and trying to shift that direction as well. And then for fats, I don't provide again a specific number that we need to hit, but I do strongly advise low saturated fat options, higher in mono and polyunsaturated fats. So nuts and seeds, avocados, those sorts of products are going to
Hmm.
be a lot just
What
healthier overall.
what would you say is a vegan source of fat that one should be cautious with, or maybe
Hmm.
include moderately? Maybe not avoid. I'd say I don't want to
Yeah, yeah.
go as far to say avoid altogether, but just be aware of how much you're consuming a particular fat.
Coconut oil for sure. Just because
Okay.
it's very high in saturated fat.
Hmm.
And we do have actually a recent meta-analysis showing that it does raise LDL cholesterol levels, which is a primary risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So definitely want to try to minimize that. Now, if you're somebody who's say LDL is super low to begin with, you can probably have a little bit more leeway than somebody who just even has a bit of a higher genetic baseline too. So there are individual differences that way to consider as well. But generally speaking, I'd say it's something to minimize.
Hmm. And can you speak on like metabolic flexibility? I hear this term thrown around quite a bit, and from my understanding, it is kind of priming your metabolism to preferentially utilize carbohydrates or fat based off of what you eat first thing in the morning. I hear this kind of talk often on fitness and nutrition podcasts. People that are following more of a high fat diet, they say start your day with higher fats. That way, your metabolism preferentially utilizes fat as energy as opposed to carbohydrates.
Okay, so I'm gonna say the thing, and you're talking about specifically for weight loss, right? Typically?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm gonna say the unpopular thing, and that's that really weight loss comes down to calories in, calories out. Um, Now, there are certain things that affect either side of that equation. For calories in, it's what you're eating and what you're absorbing. For calories out, there can be all sorts of, hypothyroidism, for example, can decrease that number. There are, certain factors that can affect that. But we actually have a really great study called the DietFits trial, where they is a large randomized controlled trial, and they compared a uh, low fat, what's considered a healthier low fat diet versus a healthier low carb diet for weight loss specifically. So these are diets that are primarily based on whole foods, and they weren't strictly plant-based or anything like that, but generally what most would consider healthy. And they found that for weight loss, there was no difference, or very
Mm.
minimal difference. They both performed pretty much the same. And they actually went further and they genotyped the individuals. So they looked at who has certain genes that might predispose them to burning a certain type of macronutrient better than others, and that. And they found that that had no impact. So
Mm.
these sort of claims around modifying your metabolism, or especially when it gets into like genetics. And I know that wasn't what you were talking about, but like being genetically predisposed to eating certain ways, and that the data is so preliminary at this point and
Hmm.
not likely to affect all that much, in my opinion. Um, Overall, it comes down to what are you eating throughout the whole day? How many calories are you burning through activity? And that's not to say that we need to count calories and all that necessarily. That's not the goal. Um, if weight loss is a goal, usually my approach would be more calorie density minded. So, how can we eat roughly the same amount of food overall and feel satiated and feel feel good that way, but just get less calories in. And that comes down to choosing typically more whole plant foods over more of the refined or animal
Refined.
foods that
Yeah.
are low or devoid of fiber.
Hmm. I'm curious because you brought up the genome testing. Are there
Yeah.
certain populations that are less inclined, or maybe their metabolism isn't as efficient to burn fat than others? Because I have had several clients come to me before and say that based off of their background, their heritage, that they have to work harder to burn fat? And I know it's a highly
Mm,
individualized question, but
mhm.
is there any studies that took a look at that?
So I'm not too sure. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if there is somewhere, but I'm not too confident in my ability to answer that. But what we do know is that losing weight is really hard, and that's because our bodies work against us in a lot of ways. So let's say someone loses a fair amount of weight and then they start to plateau. Well, the reason they're plateauing is actually there's several reasons they're plateauing. For one, your body does compensate to a degree with how many calories it's burning, so you'll burn less. And that is largely due to the fact that as you lose weight, there's less of you to keep living, essentially. Your body
Mm-hmm.
has to provide less energy because there's less of you. And so you don't, as you lose weight, you don't burn as many calories. And so that kind of, that old claim that if you cut, you know, 500 calories a day, you'll lose a pound a week. Well, as you
Mm-hmm.
lose a pound, you actually need to cut more calories to keep in that 500 calorie deficit. It
Mm-hmm.
compounds on itself. And so it's very, very difficult for that reason. And I'm sure you've had experience with
Going,
that working with people as well, right? Where there's these plateaus that
yeah,
happen, and then eventually you run
always.
out of room, right?
Yeah, you can't
Okay,
keep cutting calories.
exactly.
Yeah, that you
You
can't.
can't yeah, you can't keep shifting the needle. And so it becomes like super, super difficult, especially when you're talking about nutritional adequacy too. You don't want to keep cutting down until you're not consuming a nutritionally adequate and healthy diet too. So it's challenging. Weight loss is very, very challenging, and especially depending on where the starting point is.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm curious. You know, you mentioned earlier that losing weight, particularly, it boils
Mhm,
down to calories in, calories out. So how much
mhm,
you're consuming versus how much you're burning throughout the day. Um, Whether that's your BMR plus all the other activity that you're
yeah.
stacking on top of that. Like I know that if you have more muscle, your BMR is
Mhm,
naturally higher as well. And in my experience with my clients, it's kind of like the gold standard of wanting to lose weight and build muscle at the same time to have that body recomposition. Is there a formula that really can tap into that or to produce that type of result? I know it's a lot easier for untrained individuals that are just beginning their
mhm.
weight loss and fitness program. You put them in a calorie deficit and you put them on some type of training program. Normally, I can at least measure that shift, especially when they're doing DEXA scans to support their starting or to see that their baseline is versus 8 weeks later in my particular program. But I'm wondering if there is any type of like, is there a place where that no longer becomes possible?
I mean, the thing that makes that really challenging is I mean the easiest way to build muscle is to just be in a caloric surplus, right?
Hmm.
So now as far as gaining muscle, that's very challenging, but for maintaining muscle while losing weight, which would lower body fat percentage and maintain lean mass, higher that's where higher than that 1.6 gram protein intake comes in handy. It looks
Hmm.
like when you're actually in a caloric deficit and you're losing weight, protein intake needs to be jacked up even higher. And so that would be one factor that I think is really important. And when it comes to weight loss, I always suggest resistance training as well for the reason you mentioned that the more muscle you have, the higher your BMR, the more that you'll burn. And it's also important in that case not to focus on the scale
Hmm.
because you can be misled into thinking, oh, you're
Yeah.
not losing weight or even gaining weight when actually your body fat percentage is decreasing because you're putting on more muscle mass. But as far as some standard kind of formula or for some threshold effect with trying to lose fat and gain muscle relatively simultaneously, I'm not really sure. That'd be an interesting question to explore.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know if there is. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah.
But I know it's possible, and sometimes I also hear that it's not possible. It is very dependent on the individual and where their starting point is. If they've already been training for years, then it's going to be significantly harder to build muscle while you're in a calorie deficit. But if you are somebody that is looking to lose body fat and you haven't ever done resistance training before, and you introduce that into your program and you're in a slight calorie deficit, I think that there is room for that body recomposition to take place. But it might not last. It might be, a very limited amount before you start to lose, or you start to plateau in that sense. Um, but it is interesting because I've seen it, but
Mhm.
yet I've heard time and time again that it's not possible.
I wouldn't say it's not possible. It's very hard.
Yeah, for
That I would
sure.
say it's very hard for
For
sure,
sure.
and hard to maintain, as you mentioned too. But I wouldn't
Uh-huh.
say it's impossible.
Uh-huh. So would you say that there's any other particular advantages to someone adopting a plant-based lifestyle for performance? Obviously, there are the environmental and the ethical
Hmm. Hmm.
reasons that if that is part of your moral compass or your belief system, then yeah, that makes sense to, make that transition. But for somebody who doesn't care about that type of stuff, or maybe is not as concerned about it,
Hmm.
are there any other benefits for an athlete to make this switch?
Yeah. So one of the things, as I kind of mentioned earlier, was specifically for endurance. That's where
Endurance
we do have
athletes.
some. I believe there are at least two studies now showing that whether they were vegetarian or vegan diets tend to promote better performance, um, specifically in women. But one of the things that I would love to see research on, and this is more anecdotal at the moment because I don't think we have a lot of research on it, is recovery. I have heard that so many times at this point. And I can't go out there and claim that it's going to improve your recovery because, like I said, we don't have good research on that. But it seems to be an area that we could really use some good research on just because it's something almost every plant-based athlete I can think of has said has improved when making
Hmm.
that switch. So that would be a really interesting area to explore. And actually, Dr. Bernard and colleagues did or wrote a review paper on, I believe it was athletic performance and cardiovascular health, and they were talking about how for like arterial function and improving blood flow and those sorts of things, there were significant improvements in athletes as well. Um, and so potentially that could contribute to some of those benefits. But again, it's just an area that we're really in its infancy when it comes to the research
Hmm.
right now.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that is a highly touted reason to
Mhm.
adopt a plant-based lifestyle, for at least historically that I've seen
Yeah.
online, to switch over, is for the reduction in inflammation and soreness
Mhm.
so that you can get back to your training regime quicker, which then you can produce more results or make further adaptations quicker with less recovery time. So, um, again, anecdotally,
Yeah.
I did experience that as well. Whenever I was training as a vegetarian, that was heavily reliant on dairy as a primary source of protein. And then once I made that switch and swapped out my whey protein for a pea protein shake, and then I swapped out like Greek yogurt and cottage cheese and cheese in general for just plant-based protein sources. So like protein pastas, tofu, tempeh, seitan. I don't really eat a lot of seitan, but I know that it is a great source of protein
Mhm.
for those that can digest it and handle it. But I just noticed right away how different I felt and was able to continue training at a higher intensity for longer before feeling that type of rundown kind of like exhaustion that I would experience whenever I was training really hard, but training, also consuming those dairy products as well.
Yeah, and actually another, just a little off topic, but another protein source I want to mention because I feel like not a lot of people know about them is soy curls. Have you ever had soy curls?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You
Yeah,
can get them on
they're one of
Amazon
my
for
yeah
really cheap.
one of my absolute favorite things. Oh my God, they're
Yeah.
so good. And for people who don't know, they're basically like these dried soy chunks essentially that you soak in water
Yeah.
for about 10 minutes and they plump up and they become very meaty. It's almost like chicken. And
Yeah.
then you toss them in stir fries or I mean I just make it like a sloppy Joe sandwich or something. But
Yeah, I was gonna say
there's
it's
all
the
sorts of
equivalent of like a
things.
crumble. Yeah, it's the equivalent
Yeah,
of like a bigger, like a more chunky crumble that
yeah,
you would find in like a Gardein product or a Beyond Meat product, but it's just purely made from soy protein.
yeah.
And
It's just
I
soy,
grew
like
up on,
nothing else.
yeah, I grew up on TVP as well, and like
Mm,
those like vegetable, like texturized vegetable protein like that. And I
yeah.
know now they're coming out with like pea based like soy curls as well
Oh,
that are just
okay.
like exclusively pea and not soy too. So I think that's going to be a very booming ingredient, especially with all of these new products that are coming out and restaurants that are coming out with more plant-based options. I think that they're leaning more towards pea-based protein sources now as well.
Yeah, no, that'd be really cool. And I'm seeing that with a lot of the protein powders out there, they tend to be pea based too.
Yeah, it's interesting. Being a founder of a supplement company, I've learned so much about the industry and how things are sourced, how things are formulated, how things are packaged, and all of it, and what the label claims are. And right now, currently, there is um, a crisis happening with the just the shipping crisis between China and the United States, which is causing a significant increase in prices for things like pea protein, where these organic pea protein farms are based in China, and then year after year they have different yields, which then can affect
Mm.
the global price of pea protein as well. So like how that affects protein, supplement manufacturers like myself. It's a very fascinating industry to be in once you start to see the connectedness of everything and how, these new farms are coming online to produce more pea protein because now it is becoming a viable replacement for soy and these other products that are really reliant on that core ingredient of pea protein. So it's just a fun little piece of information that
Yeah,
I've learned over the past year being on that end of things instead of just being a consumer of a product like pea protein.
awesome. Yeah, no, I didn't know
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, and like this is a great segue into talking about supplements because I would love to hear, being a naturopathic doctor is recommending supplements part of that protocol, or is it primarily looking at nutrition through food or supplementing with more natural food
So
sources rather than synthetic supplementation?
no, I mean, I don't hold that sort of view on synthetic versus natural and that kind of thing. But um, I want to make sure that my patients are consuming. Actually, I want to make sure all vegans are consuming nutritionally adequate diets, and that includes supplementation. For example, vitamin B12 is something that I suggest, pretty much across the board. And yes, you can get enough B12 from fortified foods, things like fortified plant milks or nutritional yeast and that. But you have to be very diligent about your intake of those and make sure you're having them every day, ideally multiple times per day. And I just suggest a supplement to keep it really simple and just to have that safety net. So that's one that I always
Mhm.
recommend. Vitamin D is another one that I do recommend, at least here in Vancouver, and probably anywhere else in Canada, given that we don't have a ton of sunshine year round, and obviously our skin makes, or our bodies make vitamin D when our skin is exposed to sunlight, or at least strong sunlight. Um, so those are a couple. I often look at iodine intake as well. And that's because iodine is primarily found in iodized salt in most of our diets, but a lot of people don't consume that nowadays. I'm finding, at
Mhm.
least amongst my patients, a lot of people are using sea
Avoid salt.
salts and
Yeah.
things like that, and they're not going to be reliable. So actually, they don't really contain any iodine, so they're definitely not reliable sources of that. And so sometimes you look at iodine supplementation, or more often than not, I just suggest using an iodized salt or a low sodium salt alternative that is also iodized. Um, but if someone doesn't want to focus on these individual nutrients like that, multivitamins can be really useful. And there are a couple multis that I do typically recommend that are vegan multis as well, and they have pretty solid doses of the B12 and the iodine, and they also cover things like selenium, a little bit of calcium, um, zinc. You can get them with or without iron, and so I I think it's a nice kind of safety net to have something like a multi like that. But if someone didn't want to have a multi, I do look at those individual nutrients of concern, primarily being the B12, D, sometimes iodine, depending on dietary intake, and then seeing if there's any other gaps to fill once we review their diet.
Mhm. What's a symptom of low iodine?
So iodine deficiency can lead to hypothyroidism. So it can lead to a goiter, and so it's kind of like the lump in the throat, and then hypothyroidism can lead to fatigue, hair loss and some other not so fun symptoms. But usually we like to catch it a lot long before that is the case. And I'm actually not certain how low the threshold for iodine intake really should be. I mean, it's not like everybody who's not meeting the RDA ends up with hypothyroidism, not by any means. But I do like to make sure that they're hitting the recommended intakes just to be safe.
Hmm. And what about somebody that is meeting all of those requirements and is an athlete that's looking to optimize their performance output? Are there any other supplements that you would recommend typically or explore them taking?
Yeah, so on top of protein, which we've already covered to death at this point, creatine.
Yeah.
Absolutely would recommend creatine.
Creatine. Yeah.
It's most well-studied supplement, at least most well-studied sports supplement, but I think it may be the most well-studied supplement period in the world. Super effective for things like strength output, power output. Um, may come with other benefits. Like I know there's a little bit of research on postmenopausal women and bone health. There's a little bit on like cholesterol levels and possibly seeing some improvement there. But definitely for the physical performance benefits, I would always recommend creatine. And the standard dose is about 5 grams a day.
Hmm.
Realistically, it depends on your size, and a lot of people, someone my size, could probably do with less than that, especially for maintenance. But that's kind of the standard dose that it comes in. And another one, and this is very widely consumed already, but that's caffeine.
Mm.
Prior to a workout or to a sporting event or what have you, about an hour prior or so, is got to be one of the best, most effective pre-workouts you can take too.
Yeah, for sure. I know there's different viewpoints on caffeine, but from a performance
Mhm.
standpoint, it does make sense to supplement, especially if not only can you benefit from the extra like perceived energy, but like also the focus and some of the
Mhm.
most pre-workout formulas do contain caffeine. Some of them come with or without, and um, I know that in the bodybuilding world, caffeine has always been a huge component of
Mhm.
their supplement protocol as well. So I'm a fan. Obviously, I drink
Yeah.
coffee. The pre workout formulas that I take also have caffeine as well. So yeah, I'm also on board with that. I'm wondering if there's any other um, common one. I mean, you hear people talk about L-carnitine as a
Mhm.
mm, thermogenic aid, or glutamine for our body's ability to synthesize protein. I'm wondering if you have any information on the validity of those supplementation or those supplements as well.
Um, Yeah, I'm not super knowledgeable on those topics. I haven't seen a lot that's
Hmm.
super impressive from what I have looked at, but a couple others that do appear to have some research would be like beta-alanine, for example.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
beta-alanine seems to have some, taurine for endurance activity seems to have some too. Um, Again, I'm not, when I see a patient who's working athletic performance, I'm not going to throw like 17 supplements at them. I usually focus on
Yeah.
those ones that I mentioned as being, high impact, things that we have really good research on and we, know can improve their performance. And then everything else is kind of, additional supplemental to that, if,
Yeah.
needed and if beneficial. So, I would start with that kind of basic few there.
Yeah, and then expand on it. I'm wondering, do you have any recommendations for nutrient timing? Is that something that you talk about with your patients at all?
Not really. So, again, there's some research on like protein intake after workouts and that, but I think, and this is just my approach. It's different if we're talking about, an elite level athlete or bodybuilder or something like that.
Hmm.
It becomes different. But the benefits to things like, for example, protein intake, let's go back to that. Spreading out protein intake throughout the day, 4 times a day, having at least 20 grams per, you can stimulate muscle protein synthesis more often throughout the day. If that leads to actual performance gains, it's to a tiny degree. These sorts of things like the meal timing and the combining and this and that, they end up having a very small impact. But for somebody who's at the top of their game, that can make all the difference. For the people that I'm working with, typically, that's not, the be all end all. I'm more focused on, are you getting enough of these things? Are you meeting your nutritional requirements?
Hmm.
And probably that's what applies to, I assume, most of the people who are listening to this too. And so I'm usually a lot more focused on those aspects.
Yeah, I'm the exact same way. I tend to suggest I get this, as soon as I receive a new client and we're working together, they ask about nutrient timing, and I
Mhm.
say let's not get into the weeds on that
Yeah.
because it tends to overcomplicate things and it can overwhelm a client that's just trying to first create and establish the habits, like the fundamentals of just making sure
Hmm.
you're eating enough of the right foods and in the right portion sizes for your fitness goal, whatever that is, based off of your timeline. And then maybe if your livelihood depends on being 1% better or 0.5% better, and you're looking to optimize in that way, then you can start talking about nutrient timing. But for a majority of people that are just looking to get healthier, looking to put on some muscle, there's no need to go the extra mile to make life harder for yourself. That in the long run, in the short run, it won't yield that much more benefit or strength or improvements. But if you were to actually like readjust your lens and look at some of the other things like your sleep quality,
Hmm.
your hydration, your stress levels, those could actually yield much more benefits, not just in the gym, but like overall health wise. And I say, let's start there because most people tend to look at the gym and say, oh, maybe I'll lift 10 more pounds and I'll see some kind of significant difference. It's like you might see a very marginal difference, but if you were to optimize your sleep and get really great quality sleep, then your body's hormone levels might optimize themselves to where you can actually put on more muscle and strength and reduce your stress levels to the point where you're in a prime position to put on muscle with the food that you're consuming. So again, when it comes to the nutrient timing, I'm with you as well. Unless you're an elite athlete that's looking to be hyper competitive,
Hmm.
it's just not worth the extra effort, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just, um, and I often find that, and it's not anyone's fault. This is just what you hear from all the different voices you listen to on social media. Um, but people believe these things have a larger impact than they do, largely because a lot of the people promoting these sorts of different habits and whatnot, or different strategies, tend to exaggerate maybe a little bit on how much of a benefit can really occur.
Hmm. Yeah, one last thing on protein. Again, I know we
Mhm.
talked about protein quite a bit in
Yeah,
in
yeah,
this episode, but the leucine,
yeah.
is
Oh,
that
that's a good one.
a
Yeah.
concern or a consideration that somebody that's adopting a plant-based lifestyle and looking to optimize their muscle gain, you commonly hear that leucine is that amino acid that is kind of like the threshold
Hmm.
that determine or the limiting factor that determines how much muscle you can produce. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's actually, I can't believe I didn't touch on that at this point, to be honest. I definitely should have. So leucine is one of the amino acids, and it's kind of you can think of it as the amino acid that directs everything, and then, it's in charge, so to speak. That's kind of the way I've heard it be put in the past. And there is a threshold to which more leucine actually isn't beneficial either. So, um, leucine is the primary amino acid that stimulates what's called muscle protein synthesis. So this is like that short-term burst in muscle building activity that you can get after activity or after eating certain things. Now, the threshold for where we don't see further benefit is somewhere between like 2 to 3 grams. If we want to narrow that further, it's probably about 2.5 to 2.7 or so grams. Now, if you're hitting 1.6 grams of total protein per day, you're probably getting a fair amount of leucine, just if you're eating a variety of foods. But there are certain foods that are better sources of leucine than others. And yes, supplements can be one source. You can definitely take supplements that way. But Like soy is a great source, for example. Oats, actually, depending on how much you consume, are a pretty decent source. Protein powders in general, typically good sources. I haven't seen too many proteins that are super low in leucine. Um, and and so it is a good idea, especially for those who maybe aren't reaching that 1.6 gram of protein kind of threshold, to focus on making sure they're including a decent source of leucine at a few meals throughout the day. Again, if building muscle is their primary goal.
Okay, yeah, I'm glad you touched on that, because that's a really common, I would say, myth that's perpetuated by non-vegans when it comes to vegan protein sources, is that they always seem to mention leucine as some type of elusive amino acid
Yeah,
that is very difficult to consume. But the reality is that if you do consume a majority of the protein sources that you talked about, which is like your
yeah.
legumes, your lentils, soy, or a supplement, you're going to meet or exceed most of the time that upper threshold of leucine intake. So,
Yeah, especially if
but
you're hitting those high protein numbers overall.
yeah, yeah, exactly. But that, again, it, the other side loves to talk about how that's a limiting factor,
Yeah, yeah.
and for somebody that may not know, it's very convincing. So these types of discussions are important, because this also gives people the reassurance that as long as they're consuming enough calories, meeting their protein requirements, there's a very strong likelihood that you're also maximizing your leucine intake as well.
hmm Yeah, absolutely. And
Um,
that again, going back to that vegan versus omnivore protein study, they did actually ensure that people were consuming at least 2 grams of leucine per meal as well in both
oh,
the
nice.
the vegan and the omnivorous diet. So they did take care of that as well.
Nice. That's good. That's a great
Mhm.
consideration too for that study, because now it also further puts to rest that that argument.
Mhm.
Okay, Matt or Matthew, anything else that you want to talk about, or maybe bring into this conversation that we haven't already discussed, or if there's any other exciting news in the scientific world that we could shed light on right now before we end this conversation?
I mean, there's always new research coming out, so I've got like a
Yeah.
million studies in my head I could pull from. But really, like at the end of the day, I think and this is beyond just the athletics and protein discussion. I think we get bogged down in the little details and don't focus enough on those foundational aspects. Like, are you consuming those different food groups I mentioned, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, seeds? Are you eating enough? Are you lifting weight? A lot of people actually think you just up your protein and all of a sudden you're going to get jacked. That's not exactly how it works. You need to work
Yeah.
at it. And
You
so,
don't accidentally get jacked.
yeah, yeah.
It doesn't
Yeah, and
happen.
then and then taking care of sleep and hydration, as you mentioned, it's those foundational things that really, really matter. And then you can talk about should you be supplementing a certain thing? Should you be timing your meals a certain way? Those are all later down the road. I just want everyone to focus on those basic steps to ensure that A, you're eating a healthy diet that's going to serve you in the long term, and then B, you're eating in a way that can help you work towards your goals. And I don't think it needs to be as difficult as a lot of people try to make it sound, especially the ones who are opposed to, say, plant-based diets.
Hey everyone, apologies if the podcast abruptly stopped and you are now hearing this. The software that I'm using to record this virtual podcast is new and I'm still getting to know it. And unfortunately, the last 2 minutes of the podcast was cut off and never uploaded. So I am on here recording the outro and just wanted to say thank you all for listening to this episode with Dr. Matthew Nagra. Hopefully you found what he shared interesting. And if you did, please, please, please share it with somebody that you know, somebody that you feel might be interested or could benefit from this conversation. And if you want to share this, please do, because it does help me get more exposure to more people and ultimately help more people become healthier versions of themselves. So, as always, I am sending each and every one of you love and light. I hope you have a wonderful day.